This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Everybody, we're delighted to have Professor Robert Lee here to talk to us about Birkenhead Park. He is an honorary professor, a research professor in economics and social history at Liverpool University, and a fellow at the Academy of Social Sciences. He's the editor and co-editor of 15 books, and one of his interests research interests is the history and use of urban green space in the Merseyside area. He's been the chairman of the Friends of Birkenhead Park since 1996, and in 2014 he received an MBE for his services involved in the conservation of the park and to his services to the community. So we're very, very pleased. Thank you that you have come down this far.
Come down
to address us.
I thought you went up to London.
Oh, right.
I don't know. So, well, thank you. It's always a welcome. Always good to come here.
Yes,
into the Institute of Historical Research. I know it quite well. Not as well as you do, obviously, because you're regular attenders at the seminar, are you? Excellent. Now, just to start off, how many people here, in fact, have visited Birkenhead Park? Oh, well, I can call upon some specialist knowledge then, but it's even more disturbing to see that an overwhelming majority have never, ever been there. How do we explain that?
It's foreign.
It's
foreign.
It's foreign. Good heavens. But you see, I borrowed this phrase, a gift to urban civilization. In fact, the full quote should be one of Britain's gifts to urban civilization. It was coined by Rowan Moore. Does that name ring any bells?
Right,
the architecture columnist for The Observer. Only a couple of months ago, and of course, as many of you will understand, that Birkenhead Park for many years was the only Grade 1 listed park on what used to be English Heritage's Historic England's register. One of the top 6 or top 10 parks in the whole world, depending upon your criteria. But a fairly important place, and obviously a place that very few of you have ever bothered to visit. I am astounded, and I must say, disappointed.
You have to encourage.
Pardon?
You have to encourage.
Well, this is what I've come down here for, really, because what I want to talk about, in essence, is this. Now, no one disputes at all the overriding significance of the park. If you draw, say, on the writings of Frederick Law Olmsted, a name I'm sure you all recognise, he was actually bowled over when he came to Birkenhead Park and regarded it as something so important that it actually went on to really inform a lot of his own designs in America and further afield. But if you look at what Olmsted had to say when he came to Birkenhead Park, it really is almost like a political statement that he came out with. He was so inspired by his 2 visits. He came initially in 1850, then again in 1854, that it really directly affected his concept of a public park. Something that included, I quote, where the poorest British peasant was free to enjoy it in all its parts, while local residents, quote, had the pride of an owner in it. And in a sense, that sort of was developed much more into the wider concept that he came forward with about what a public park was supposed to achieve. But what I really want to question is whether, in fact, Olmsted and other contemporary landscape designers fully appreciated the context in which Birkenhead Park had been developed. Because I think, although we have accepted their view their interpretation of Birkenhead Park in its wider symbolic role, political role in a sense. I think Olmsted and other commentators probably failed to understand what really lay behind the origins and operation of Birkenhead Park. They failed to do that for 4 reasons, and I'll go through these particular points in turn. First of all, the way that the park was funded, which in essence depended upon making available perimeter lands for high-class residential accommodation. Secondly, because although there was a very strong emphasis upon active recreational sports, they were not really solely available to everyone. It was a highly controlled environment in which that aspect of a public park was taken forward. Nor did Olmsted and other contemporaries really understand where Birkenhead was within the context of the evolutionary process of democratic change, and how the political framework of managing a public park would actually have serious implications in terms of its general availability to the public at large. And finally, they probably misunderstood the reaction of the people, because they were supposed to become the owners, to have a real interest in maintaining Birkenhead Park. But what do we know about how people, how contemporaries, how ordinary people reacted to the sudden provision for the first time of a publicly funded park in a township like Birkenhead? So I'm going to look at some evidence of criminal activity to see if we can actually begin to try and examine that type of perspective to a far greater extent. There we are. When was Birkenhead Park? Does it give you the dates? When was it, David? When was it opened?
1840.
I was going to say 1843.
Good heavens.
6.
Michael Ann, you'll be, as the co-chair, you'll probably know the date off by heart, won't you?
I'm not number 38.
38?
Yes.
Good heavens, this lack of knowledge in the capital city of our country is really.
Oh, yes, it was.
It was the 5th of April, 1847, and you can see, typically British weather, or weather that you might actually encounter in the north. But people were extremely impressed because it marked the opening of a park, the likes of which had never really been seen before. If you want evidence of that, let's look at the so-called public parks that were opened and created before the opening of Birkenhead Park. Moore Park in Preston, who's keen to see that? No one. Really common lands, very rough, not landscaped until the early 1860s by a prominent landscape designer. Would you know his name? Edward Milner? Does that ring any bells? The Derby Arboretum, of course, extremely famous, opened in 1840. They claim to be the first public park in the world, but in fact that's totally false. Why? As I've indicated, it was private donation. Josiah Strutt, a local owner of a silk mill. It was run by a board of trustees. The general public, ordinary working class people, were able to go there only after church on a Sunday. If they went during the week for whatever reason, if they had time off work, they had to pay an entry charge of only 1 or 2 pence, but nevertheless a clear disincentive. So we can't see that as in any way a public donation. Prince's Park in Liverpool, now I'm glad to say equally a Grade 1 historic England park, but only one person has ever been there. What sort of 2 people? Well, I must say this is getting better. But this was really clearly a private development right from the start by Yeats. brought in, of course, Paxton, fantastic, ornate landscape, but it had limited access. There was an area that was actually sealed off to the general public, and it didn't become owned by Liverpool City Council until 1919. So, not really applicable. And then, of course, in August 1846, you have 3 parks, again in the north, 2 in Manchester, Phillips Park and Queen's Park, and Peel Park in Salford. Significant development as far as making green space available to the urban working class. But they were all largely funded by private subscription. I think out of the £35,000, only £3,000 came from central government. And of course, the people who had wealth subscribed the most, although there were significantly some working class contributions. And finally, closer to home, I suppose, Victoria Park remained a royal park until 1887, technically. So that's why Birkenhead Park in that context is really important. It was, the idea for Birkenhead Park was articulated in 1841. A private bill was promoted in 1842. It was taken forward on the basis of Birkenhead's Second Improvement Act of 1843. It cost in total £127,000. Just to put that into context, the 3 Manchester/Salford parks cost in total only £35,000. And £126,000 in 2014 prices. Any ideas? Any economists amongst us? Any guesses? Come on, don't be frightened, otherwise I'll have to...
A couple of million.
Pardon?
A couple of million.
Couple of million. £10.5 million. So that, really is a significant investment. And the first sod was cut in 1844. The major plantings were done during the winter of 1844-45. It was used by people already in 1845, but its opening was delayed until 1847, so it could take place simultaneously with the opening of the Birkenhead Docks, which was another major development of that period. And it is rumoured that an immense public attended that event. There were lots of activities and games, and it was really something to celebrate. It was designed to represent an appropriate balance between a picturesque, beautiful environment and a pleasure ground for the general public, with a strong emphasis on leisure activities. Chadwick, always someone you can refer to even today, stated that its greatness lay, and I quote, in its utility, in its combination of suburb and public recreation area, ahead of anything else anywhere at its time. So what did Paxton create for us? That's his map, a very famous map of what was termed Birkenhead New Park in 1844. Upper and lower park, divided by a road. What he produced, of course, were sinuous pathways with ever-changing vistas, so that no matter where you were walking, you were always confronted by something new from nature. 2 lakes, really impressive and very substantial in size. What was called the grotto, but is more commonly known as the rockery. And you can see how he was borrowing from ideas that he was taking forward in his sort of ordinary employment as the head gardener to the 6th Duke of Devonshire, because of course he started on the big rockery at Chatsworth. When was that? 1843. So, he was applying for use within a public park context some of the concepts in relation to landscape design that were really originally intended for the very rich. Series of ornamental bridges. This is the Iron Bridge, covered in snow, so you can't really see it. But again, that was symbolic, deliberately chosen, I think, because the main source of employment in Birkenhead was the shipyard of John and William Laird, and they pioneered the use of iron for the construction of steamships. So there was a clear resonance in terms of what that signified locally, but also in the context of what the Industrial Revolution in a wider sense represented as well. And a wooden bridge, sometimes known as the Rustic Bridge, again a classical type for its era. In the distance you can see the Swiss Bridge, because many of these facilities were actually meant to recreate the Grand Tour, crossing the Alps, going through the rockery, confronting the Swiss Bridge. There's also a Roman boathouse. The architectural design of some of the lodges fits within this general pattern. Whereas the grand entrance, which really Paxton thought was too grand, he required it to be modified in height, is really impressive. I mean, what do you think it reminds you of?
The entrance to Hyde Park.
Indeed, or in Berlin, the Berliner Tour, the Arc de Triomphe, perhaps, I don't know. Probably sort of sending out a very simplistic but powerful message that Birkenhead, which only had maybe a population then of 30,000 people, was up amongst the leading townships in the country as far as being innovative and creating the context for the development of a future city, as it was known. But it wasn't only Olmsted who was bowled over by what he saw. If you look towards the continent, you can see many of the leading landscape designers really picking up on not only the quality of Paxton's design, but the wider political significance of what a public park represented. Just let me quote from a few. Adolphe Alphand, is that a name that rings bells? His most important published work, Les Promenades de Paris, referred to Birkenhead Park, quote, as a work of art. He included Paxton's map, the 1844 map, in his volume. Edouard André, another really important French landscape designer, in his Traité général de la composition des parcs et jardins, quote, Birkenhead Park was a site where Joseph Paxton first developed his most important ideas on a large scale. And André's correspondence with Olmsted demonstrated his awareness of the link between Birkenhead Park and Central Park, and he copied directly the role of mounds in landscaping parks, what is known in French as vallonnement. That really, dig out, create a lake, you have your surrounding mounds, and plant your trees on top of the mounds. That was really something that he picked up very much from Birkenhead Park. And we mustn't forget again, if we're trying to trace the wider significance of Birkenhead Park, the role of Edward Kemp, someone who is often neglected, I think, unjustifiably. Does anyone know anything about Edward Kemp? Someone, I'm sure. No? Never heard of him? Disappointed, really.
He wrote on garden
He wrote a
design.
book.
Yeah.
You know, I thought people in London were really keeping up to date. We're going to commemorate the 200th anniversary of his birth, I think, in 2017. He was appointed in 1843 on Paxton's recommendation as the first fixed superintendent of Birkenhead Park. And he went on really to serve in that capacity, although it's a very complex story, until he died in 1891. So that's an incredible length of time carrying out that important role. But from about 1860 onwards, he was simply retained on a consultancy basis. But, you know, according to Olmsted, many people actually believed that Birkenhead Park had been designed by Kemp, and J.C. Niven, who was the curator of the Botanic Gardens in Hull, was unequivocal in praising Kemp's initiative in instigating what he termed, I quote, a new era as regards public park design, for creating a landscape which would stand, quote, as a lasting memorial to his good taste. The Wolverhampton Park and Bath Committee came and visited Kemp in 1878 when they were seeking real advice on how best to create their first park. And even before that, in 1857, the commissioners in New York, when they were seeking to adjudicate between the 33 submissions for what was to become Central Park, passed a motion saying they wanted to summon Kemp to New York to provide specialist advice. He was really, I think, for the most of the mid and late 19th century, the real arbiter of good taste as far as landscape design is concerned in general, not only in relation to parks. His series of articles, for example, on Biddulph Grange, I'm sure some of you must have read them. They were held in high esteem. He was a fantastically important author. His famous book, which went into dozens of editions, you'll tell me at the back, won't you? We're not in your head. Pardon?
I can't remember the name.
How to lay out a garden.
Small garden.
Or how to lay out a
Small garden.
But do you know what he meant by small? Think big. 30 acres. Has anyone got a little garden?
Just like
30 acres. That's small, you see. Anyway, that's just to give you some indication of the major parks that Kemp designed, most of them in the northwest except for Saltwell Park in Gateshead. So, an important landscape, an important turning point in the history of parks in general. And just to reinforce this, just to focus on the significance of Birkenhead Park as a gift to urban civilization, I want to make 2 points. I want to return to Olmsted, and I want to talk more about the concept of a people's park, a public park. Now, as I've indicated, Olmsted first came to Birkenhead in the summer of 1850, at the start of a tour with his brother through England and the northern parts of the continent. And he was, as I've indicated, full of passionate admiration for Paxton's masterpiece. Quote, 5 minutes of admiration and a few more spent in studying the manner in which art has been employed to obtain from nature so much beauty, and I was ready to admit that in democratic America there was nothing to be thought of as comparable with this people's park. Indeed, I was satisfied that gardening had here reached a perfection that I had never before dreamed of. He was impressed, I think, primarily by 2 elements. The fact that it was freely accessible and the quality of the landscape design. You can see this is a simple quotation. All this magnificent pleasure ground is entirely, unreservedly, and forever the people's own. The poorest British peasant is as free to enjoy it in all its parts as the British Queen. Although Queen Victoria never condescended to visit. But it also really, by creating a People's Park, provided lots of other benefits, because he argued that the provision of a park in any town would represent a positive contribution to the health, strength and morality of its people. It would help to increase material wealth, park scenery would have beneficial psychological effects, and the pastoral landscape would be the most effective means of counteracting what he termed the debilitating influence of city life, something that I'm sure you experience on a day-to-day basis in London. Or am I wrong? But equally important is the concept of a public or people's park, because Birkenhead Park was developed and opened before the 1848 Public Health Act, and what people could see in Birkenhead was that this type of development really made sense. It created, in a wider context, a more democratic and meaningful environment that would really enable ordinary people to appreciate the benefits of nature in an urban context. And as we know, from the late 1840s onwards, there are a string of parks, public parks, so-called, created in England and Scotland. I've counted so far at least 10 between the People's Park in Halifax and the People's Park in Banbury in 1897, but there may well be others. So, as a concept, that's important. Birkenhead Park really was the start of people beginning to think along the lines that Olmsted articulated, that a public People's Park could really make a big difference. But what I'm going to say now is that really Olmsted's understanding and the interpretation that many other eminent landscape designers put on the significance of Birkenhead Park was in some sense a little bit misplaced. That the realities that lay behind the development of the first publicly funded park in Birkenhead was somewhat different. Now, right from the start, the intention of the commissioners for the improvement of Birkenhead was to recoup all the expenditure by selling perimeter land for high quality housing. In fact, in 1844, Paxton was already summoned to discuss how that could best be taken forward. It was deferred and deferred until the 2nd of July, 1845, when, on the basis of this plan, they attempted to sell quite a few lots. Now, this is the park. You can't really see it. It's not all that clear. There's lot 13. There's lot 6 here, and it goes all the way around outside the perimeter carriageway that was an integral part of the park. But out of the 43 lots, only 15 were sold. There was a lot of public concern about some of the commissioners having a special interest. They had to withdraw their offers, and then other private people who would bid for lots were allowed to rescind those. Didn't go well. A year later, Paxton produced what was mistakenly, misleadingly called Plan Number 1. Here you can see, in far greater detail what they intended to do. Some had already been sold, like lot 21, lot 14 was not for sale. A fairly sort of ambitious undertaking. If you add up all the number of villas, semi-villas, and terraced high-class housing, 466 housing units were put forward for sale. A significant number. But again, only 4 lots were sold. It was a miserable return as far as attracting wealthy residents or speculators was concerned. In 1847, they set up what was known as the Birkenhead Park Land and Building Company to take over responsibility for carrying forward the sale. 60 local merchants, members of the commercial elite, became subscribers, but they failed. They never really undertook anything. And the actual sale of these perimeter lots was a long, drawn-out process, partly because the commissioners had been rather inefficient. They had failed to obtain title from the lord of the manor, from whom they bought most of the land in the first instance, because they hadn't paid him up properly. Partly because some of the key figures, like John Laird, had sold some land himself to the commissioners. He was a commissioner himself and made a 700% profit, but there were particular rules and regulations applying to the conveyance, which actually meant that it wasn't at all attractive for anyone to purchase that part of the perimeter land. So it was only belatedly that, for example, by the end of the 19th century, only 78 properties had been built. That was one of them. Number 1, Cavendish Road, in Lot 17. It was an elegant Gothic building designed by Walter Scott. But this is significant as well, because what I want to indicate is that the lots that they sold were not for single houses. Lot 17 was purchased by Thomas Brassey. Does that name ring any bells? Perhaps the most successful railway entrepreneur ever. He bought Lot 17 and eventually constructed number 1, number 2 and number 3 Cavendish Road. But this was really part of a wider property portfolio. By the 1850s, 1860s, he'd acquired, I think, 23 substantial properties in and around the area of Birkenhead Park, which were kept in the estate of the Countess Brassey until 1921. So here you see the quality, the workmanship of the properties that were constructed, and the fact that people were really trying to attract purchasers of wealth. And that, of course, had implications in terms of who became the residents of these properties, who actually took up residence surrounding the park. I've just taken a bit of information from a street directory for 1876, partly choosing this because here is Edward Kemp living at 74 Park Road West. But look at the occupations of his neighbours. Shipbroker, corn merchant, shipbuilder, broker, managing director of the London Asiatic and American Company. These were all important players. If, as we've done in a wider context for another project, if you look at the indicators of wealth, and some of these individuals are really quite well endowed. Just in Cavendish Road, sticking there, some of the former occupants, Isaac Bancroft Cook, a cotton broker who died in 1887, just over £2 million. Charles Gray Mott, a colliery owner and a railway developer. In fact, some of your best underground lines were constructed later on by Mott, 2.2 million. And Alfred Bilson, a solicitor who died in 1907, 7.1 million. These are in 2014 prices, but even so. Bilson's interesting. He was the political agent for Gladstone. He was knighted. and died in the House of Commons. Equally, we can look at other sorts of indicators of relative wealth, because probate data is tricky. They're the sort of the effects. Often people disposed of property or assets before they died. But another indicator is, in fact, the size of their domestic household establishment, in particular how many servants they retained. And here again you get the same type of picture. They were really quite well endowed. In 1881, William Higgins, a retired cotton broker, had 5 servants, a housekeeper, 2 housemaids, a waitress, cook and kitchen maid. And that wasn't really too untypical of the wealth that people had. I'll cite 2 examples of particular individuals. William Hind and his brother John Hartley Hind, because William Hind was a commissioner, as was his brother John Hartley Hind. William, for example, between November 1865 and October 1866, attended 76 committee meetings of the commissioners. They both lived in Ashfield Road, which is the road that bisects the Upper and Lower Park, and they were both incredibly wealthy. When William Hind died in 1882, his probate amounted to 7.3 million, and when his younger brother died in 1889, it amounted to 12 million. And you can go along selecting for different periods of time other local residents, and you can see the extent to which they were not only wealthy but politically interconnected. They were people who actually held office and therefore had in many senses managerial responsibility for the park. This, I would argue, had implications for the use of the park. Now, I'll come on to say a little bit more about the development of a bowling facility later on. But
Sorry, may I ask a question,
yes,
please? The people who bought the houses in the park, or
Yeah.
around the park, was there something in the house covenants that said they had to be involved with looking after the park?
absolutely not. You wouldn't expect people of that wealth to be concerned with menial responsibilities like that, would you? Well, you know, closing the gates, that was all right for people who were accommodated in the lodge, but they were often
No, I meant
employees.
but being financially competent, having committees, being being
Well,
friends of the park like we have now.
Well, I don't think they would have seen it exactly in that light. They were people who were politically engaged. This connection between commercial wealth, driver really for the whole development of Merseyside, and political power. A very sort of heady mix really. But also, as I've indicated, something that meant that they exercised influence about what actually happened in the park. This is the critical point. It's not until 1882 that a public recreation ground is established. This is, opened in 1847, 1882 is the first opportunity that ordinary people would have had to actually, in this case, to play bowls and to play quoit. And it's interesting that some of the politicians then saw this in the sense also not only of enabling people to get fresh air and recreation, but something that would actually discipline them. Here's a quote from Councillor Fred Smith. A ground of this kind, quote, well managed, well conducted, with discipline as strict as that of the army, would have its influence on the working classes, quote, so that all classes would mix together with mutual advantage. Equally, it was only in 1885 that Birkenhead Park got its first bandstand, and yet band houses, as they were initially known, started to appear generally in the country when? 1860s. Paul Rabbits has written a very brief but very good book on this. So how can we account for this strange delay of what really could be regarded as a great public facility? Also, it was something that offered a civilizing role. And it's the same story. As early as 1851, there were ideas that something like this should be developed in the park. But most of the people surrounding the park, again with exercising political influence, were totally opposed. Even in the early 1880s, when pressure for some facility along these lines became far stronger, you find a similar reaction by the people who had a vested interest in keeping the park as it was originally designed. They didn't want noise in their back garden, so to speak. And one of the most outspoken critics was actually John Hartley Hind, who'd been an earlier commissioner, been a very important person, and was probably one of the wealthiest citizens of the township. But there are other sets of issues that really impinge upon how the landscape evolved and what use ordinary people could make of it. And that's really the political context in which a public park was managed. Now, if you look at Edward Kemp, he actually had to respond to a whole series of different committees, and they're so numerous that I'll have to read them out. Initially, the Improvement Committee between 1843 and 1845, then the Road and Improvement Committee between 1845 and 81, then the Health and Baths Committee, 1880 to 1881, and then the Health and Road Committee in 1881 itself, and finally the Health, Baths and Parks Committee, which ran until 1893. It wasn't until 1893 that a separate committee was created to manage parks and the township's sole cemetery, Flaybrick, which also in fact had been designed by Kemp. So what does this tell us? Because each of these committees had a different composition, a different number of commissioners as members, they had a different remit, and yet they controlled the use of landscape space. They really had a role in determining what purposes were fulfilled as far as public access was concerned. And it's very interesting in that context that the public recreation ground, which was opened in 1882, is developed precisely when it is a health committee responsibility. In fact, the health committee had a sanitary subcommittee, and it was a sanitary subcommittee that had managerial control over Birkenhead Park. Hence the development of a bowling green, a quoiting ground, and in 1888 a new skittle alley was constructed, a timber skittle alley, in order to give the working class recreation. Per game you had to pay threepence for bowls, a penny for quoits, and a penny for a go at the skittles. And if you read the Medical Officer of Health's report, they're full of praise for the role of the Health Committee in carrying forward this initiative, which altered, of course, the use of Paxton's landscape. But perhaps because of the cost involved, the popularity of particularly skittles collapsed after the first year, and by the early 1890s it had been discontinued. What's interesting also to note is that this was a development that took place in one of the perimeter areas that had originally been set aside for sale for upper class housing, and therefore it didn't impact so radically on Paxton's design. And by the early 1890s, the general view was that the park was no longer suitable for developing alternative recreational activities for the working class, particularly for what were deemed to be weakly and enfeebled children. And the whole emphasis, the whole thrust in terms of policy after the 1890s is much more in favour of developing playgrounds, so saving Paxton's landscape from any negative impact. And equally tied up with this sort of nexus of political issues and contexts was the tendency really from an early date to see the park as a potential focal point for public works to alleviate unemployment, which was the first park ever created solely as a result of a public works measure. Pardon? It's also in the northwest. The northwest has the most wonderful array of historic parks. Pardon?
Was it Sefton?
No, it's Alexandra Park. Primarily because, of course, the impact of the cotton famine, the American Civil War, cotton operatives, and they were therefore employed to create Alexandra Park in the early 1860s. But this is taken up increasingly in the 1870s, in the 1880s. An important turning point was the Unemployed Workman Act of 1905, which enabled local authorities to spend money on relief schemes, and in fact, shortly after that, councils were forced to spend money in that area. Now, the importance of this is really worth exploring. First of all, in the latter decades of the 19th century, all the public works schemes that were applied in Birkenhead Park were small scale. They were to deal with maintenance, painting the railings, doing some hard labouring, cleaning the lakes, nothing that really interfered at all with the landscape. But if you move forward a little bit to the cataclysmic environment of the 1920s, the Geddes Acts, the Depression of 1921, you can see how the principle of public works was taken further. Once that was established, then the park was no longer sort of immune from that type of political influence. In 1921, they came up with an idea of constructing a 50 feet wide arterial road through the lower park. It would have destroyed the landscape, because central government was keen on these sorts of high visibility projects like HS2 today, you could say. The year after, they thought, well, they'd convert the Figure of Eight Lake into a yachting pool for model ships. So the precedent that was established before 1914 of seeing the park as a focal point for public works schemes actually ultimately led to a situation where the landscape integrity that Paxton hoped would persist was ultimately destroyed. Another issue that I think really reflects on the importance of class and as a determinant of what really went on and how a public park was used can be seen in this overhead. What does that tell you? Any sort of suggestions?
That they were all for men.
Well, of course. Well, yes, except archery. I'll come on to show you. Cricket, bowls, tennis. Well, they're all essentially middle-class sports. I mean, this reference to football, of course, is misleading, as I'm sure you'll understand. They referred to football as rugby. And football, or working-class football, was only allowed at a much later stage in 1879. What's critical to note is that a lot of the sport, here we are. This is a picture of the Wirral Archers, established in 1858, and I think women outnumber men. Here is the Birkenhead Park Cricket Club, established and opened a year before the park itself was opened, but very much a high-class, upper-class, middle-class club. We've examined the actual membership, the early membership of the club, and they're all taken from the same sorts of social groupings. They're brokers, they're merchants, they're people who are also politically connected. And in its early years, the members of the Birkenhead Park Cricket Club had special concessionary rates. You know, Edward Kemp was told to do this and sort something out without actually charging them for it. So it just reflected the extent to which class really was the driver of sports provision, and sport really wasn't accessible to everyone at all. More importantly, if you wanted to play an organised sport, you had to belong to a club. And increasingly in the 1880s, they made that extremely strict. So it's not until 1879 that they actually set aside a little piece of land in the park for what they termed promiscuous cricket. I wonder what they meant by that. Have you ever played promiscuous cricket?
Not that I
Oh, dear, dear, dear. And girls were not allowed to play in the upper park until 1903. So you get and in part that actually reflected the reality of economic considerations, because this is the picture that I came across only fairly recently. It's a stereoscopic one, as you can see. All the upper park was devoted to grazing sheep, really from 1845-6 onwards until 1901, 1902. Not only because that sort of reflected exactly what the Duke of Devonshire would have seen from Chatsworth looking out, you can still see the sheep there today, but there was another good reason.
kept your grass cut.
Well, yes, it saved on labour costs. Cash, because the person whose sheep grazed on the park paid a significant rental. So the reality of managing it politically and economically really affected the type of public provision that, in that sense, was restricted. Now, it's so difficult to know how people reacted, ordinary people reacted to Birkenhead Park when it was opened, or in the decades following its formal opening in 1847. We don't have any diaries, and if they do exist, I came across one recently by Elizabeth Lee, not, I'm afraid, a relative. They tend to be really from people who came from slightly better segments of society. But if you turn to...
What's a dog bar?
Well, I was going to ask you, you're the experts on landscape, please tell me what a dog bar is. You haven't got the faintest. Good heavens, you know.
Somewhere where you tie them up.
No. An American colleague said it was a place where dogs went for a drink. Serious comment.
It's those little railings around flower beds.
No, you're getting there. I should really take a picture. Larger railings have a sort of secondary lower area, and on top of that are small, sharp spikes, so dogs can't climb over or climb between. But this is really, this is a park open for the public, for the first time. And look what they're doing to it, They're trashing it, aren't they?
Only 3 items per year.
Well, 3 years, but these were the only ones recorded. Bear that in mind. So they're not in any sense a clear indication of the totality of criminal activity. Trespassing with guns, shooting birds, breaking trees, damaging trees, willful breaking of park railings. How are we to interpret this? Because if you go forward into the 1850s, it's a similar story. At least 46 separate incidences of petty crime, vandalism, antisocial behaviour. Iron railings, quote, maliciously broken, the seats in the temple above the boathouse, much defaced, with parties cutting their names therein. Several dog bars broken, number of trees damaged, including a very handsome holly tree, the bark of which was peeled off. And what was that? Depredations as a result of the plucking of flowers. How are we going to interpret this? what does it tell us about, Olmsted was so categorical, this was a people's park for everyone to enjoy equally as owners. He used that term owner. What does it tell us about the people's reaction?
Everybody's property is nobody's property.
Pardon?
Everybody's property is nobody's property.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of things.
Probably less than we would have today.
Oh, good heavens, yes, I can't quite agree. Well, is it to do with Chartism? Some people, is it a political act?
It's all the sort of thing that the common people would do
The
on
common
land, as it were.
Oh, well, yes. Well, some people have said because, mistakenly, some of the land had been common land that was used for Birkenhead Park, that this was some sort of Chartist reaction. But the Chartists actually were very, very keen on public parks and green open space, so I think we can discount that. Other people have said it's part of what could be termed an oppositional culture. I think that's probably what you're trying to get at. Tree maiming was actually quite common, deliberately targeted at trees on private estates. It was a rural phenomenon, and of course in the 1840s, many of the people coming and working in Birkenhead were rural immigrants, and perhaps they brought this sort of sense of social protest with them.
What
Or-
was the footfall? What percentage of people were criminal?
Yes, was the park open though? Or
Yeah, well, it was
closed at
initially,
night?
but by 1849 they'd actually had all the gates imposed, and it was policed quite extensively. So.
In 1849?
Yes.
But before that it wasn't?
Yeah. Was it, again I'm going to call on Olmsted, he claimed that people just did not know what a public park represented. They were simply unaware. They were ignorant of a park, quote, properly so called, and therefore needed to be restrained from abusing it. And if you look at what he put in place in Central Park, New York, he had 50 park keepers in place, actually more park keepers than park gardens. Proper uniform, heavily militarized, almost as if they were part of the militia. This was Birkenhead Park's equivalent. This is a photograph, very rare, dated to 1909, which shows the only 4 park keepers that were in place, and underneath it they actually had written something rather sweet. Here's Joss and Charlie and the other 2. When flowers are blooming, they have much to do to keep the children and the blossoms separate. So nothing in that sense really changes, does it? But more importantly, perhaps as an explanation, is the reality of the economic situation in the late 1840s. Now, any suggestions if we wanted to look at what was going on in the real world?
There was the Hungry 40s.
The Hungry 40s, getting close.
We've got lots of it.
Fun.
We've got the famine
Famine in Ireland, yes.
Increasing.
You've got a financial economic crisis, probably, at least as far as the advanced economies were concerned, as serious as 2008. Overinvestment, speculative overinvestment in railway development, stocks and shares, bank collapses. Population of Birkenhead fell by 50%. Weeds were growing in the streets. Rateable income collapsed. The police were entirely withdrawn from Birkenhead Park because the commissions couldn't pay, and the commissions didn't pay outstanding bills to contractors. It was a real mess. And maybe that started things off on a bad foot, and from then on, crime became a regular problem. So what can we conclude? Because I see that we've moved on in time. What I try to argue is that there's no question about the overriding importance of Birkenhead Park as the first publicly funded park, not only in Britain, but in the world. There's no question about the quality, one could say the unique quality of Paxton's design. But the interpretation of the wider significance of Birkenhead Park really has to be revisited. You could say we even have to think about deconstructing this concept of what a public park really represented then and in later time. Because as we've seen, in order to fund this very important development, the Commission has opted to develop perimeter land. It wasn't an original idea, and it was an idea that was practiced elsewhere by local authorities. In Liverpool, for example, in relation to Newsham Park, similar process. Develop something for everyone or for the working class, but make sure that other people pay for it, not the ratepayers. But that, as I've argued, has had implications. Who were the people who moved into these high-quality residences? They were extremely wealthy, they were politically connected, they were really active politically, in many senses responsible directly for managing the park and determining future strategy about the use of land within the park. And even from the start, issues like social class really stand out as being something that we can't ignore. These parks were created, Birkenhead Park in particular, within a given socio-economic political framework. And in order to understand what it meant and what the concept of a people's park or public park really represented, those are factors that really cannot be neglected. And beyond that, we have to explore other sorts of evidence, profile of crime, antisocial behaviour, all aspects like that, to try and piece together more effectively how ordinary people responded to the first public park. Because here, drinking in the park, of course we have no real photographs of Birkenhead Park. Petty thefts, stolen fruit is sweetest always, isn't it? Many of the working class came from inner urban slums, dreadful housing conditions. Park became very early on a lover's paradise, and you can see it's openly flaunted almost in this postcard. The manufacturer of the postcard created a lover's walk for almost all the parks in the country. So, it was saying, good, get on with it, enjoy it. But nothing really should detract from the overriding beauty, importance, and the legacy of Birkenhead Park. It is the world's first publicly funded park, but what we need to do is to understand it more critically within the context in which it was created. And we're intent on really taking forward the park as much as we can, despite the severity of local authority cuts as a result of Osborne's austerity programme, and we're now seriously trying to take forward submitting it for consideration as a World Heritage Site. So briefly, I hope I haven't tested you too much and asked you too many questions, but thank you.